Hello YouTube and welcome to a quite different video. Today we will take a look at what would have happened if the Empire had decisively won the Great War. So we're basically looking at an alternate history of Tamriel. Cody, please don't sue me. So, as I said, I was asked to look at the possible outcome for the Great War, one in which the Empire decisively defeated the Dominion. Now, in the timeline that we play in, the Empire was nearly wiped out by the Dominion when the Dominion attacked the Empire in the year 171 of the 4th era. This war with the Empire lasted 4 years and went worse for the Empire almost every year. But then the forgotten hero from the Elder Scrolls Legends turned the tides by removing the Orb of Vermina, a Daedric artifact, from the hands of the Dominion, thereby removing their strategic advantage. The Empire then with great effort collected the last forces that scattered around the Empire and used this last force to reconquer the Imperial city and completely destroy the Dominion's large army in Cyrodiil. This came as a huge surprise to the Dominion, because the Dominion did not know the Empire had any forces left at this point. Then, when the Dominion was still in the dark as to how many troops the Empire had left, the Emperor sued for peace. And then the White Gold Concordat happened. The Thalmor got their wish by banning Talos and the Blades, and the Empire received war reparations from the Thalmor. The Empire also had to lose Hammerfell, because Hammerfell did not want to give away part of its land to the Dominion as agreed with the White Gold Concordat. Thus, the Empire had to make Hammerfell independent, and Hammerfell got a separate treaty. Now, for full info on all this, please watch my Great War videos and my White Gold Concordat video. They are all both in the description. But now, there's a lot of people who say, what if the Empire fought on after the last battle, the Battle of the Red Ring? Could they have won? Well, no, they could not have. In this last attack at the Red Ring, that last attack were basically all their last reserves. All of Cyrodiil lay in ruins and it would have been very hard to defend from that moment onward. The Dominion still occupied all the southern cities and those garrisons were not really ready to just give up, and the Empire had no forces left to retake those cities. Peace was the logical option at that point. However, so some people are saying this is basically all big win for the Dominion. Some people are even saying that it's a victory for the Empire because the Empire basically stopped itself from being completely destroyed. Other people are saying it's a draw. I personally go with the draw. However, how would the Empire have won this war decisively in this scenario? To be honest, no idea. There are a lot of possible scenarios to this, but I'm not covering them all. We will just take a look at what its effects would be when the Empire would decisively win this war, and maybe look a little bit at strategy. So, for this I have two scenarios of which to look at. Scenario number 1, the Empire defeats the initial Dominion invasion forces of Hammerfell and Cyrodiil, basically stopping the invasion and defeating the armies in the first few weeks of the war in the year 171 of the 4th era. And then, a second scenario, the Empire somehow manages to fight on after the Battle of the Red Ring, so the final battle of the actual Great War, and manages to free all of Cyrodiil and Hammerfell during the years 175 of the 4th era and 176 of the 4th era. These two scenarios are so radically different in possible outcomes that I felt like I needed to cover them separately. And keep in mind, whatever I will speculate is purely my perspective of what will happen. I discussed this scenario with a lot of people and they all had different views, and so might you have different views on the scenario as well. And I would like to hear it in the comments, if you have one. So type those text walls, man. So, the first scenario. The Dominion attacks. The first days of the war go along the same lines as it is in our own universe. Southern Cyrodiil is being invaded by one army, meanwhile another army tries to quickly march to the Gold Coast between Anvil and Skvatch, quickly to get to Hammerfell, and the naval transports on the coastline of Hammerfell will then be, well, assisted by the reinforcements that came through Cyrodiil to Hammerfell. Now, this plan completely fails in this scenario. The Empire is very much able to hold southern Cyrodiil using their open battlefield tactics to fight the Dominion troops in the south through a standstill. Meanwhile, the Empire is managed to stop the army in the Gold Coast and basically also halts that army and slowly drives this army back into a retreat into Valenwood. With these troops, these Dominion reinforcements not arriving in Hammerfell to assist the naval landings, the naval troops get completely annihilated by the Imperial garrisons. In our timeline, the Hammerfell War and securing the coast of the Hammerfell, well, that went very well for the Dominion. And it went very quickly, because the Imperial legions were completely outnumbered by the naval forces and the reinforcement forces, and the Red Guards were not very helpful, because, well, they were in civil war, and thus all of Hammerfell was basically in chaos. In this timeline, the legions would not be outnumbered and would be capable to handle the naval landings, because the Dominion reinforcements that would outnumber them would have never arrived, because those were stopped in Cyrodiil and driven back to Valenwood. So, in a few weeks the conflict would completely be decided, and the Dominion would see that it would have been better to just make peace. Now, this scenario, both the Empire and the Dominion had their defenses still standing in Cyrodiil and the Southern Dominion provinces, and the Dominion still had a lot of troops back home in the form of reinforcements. The Empire was in no shape to invade the Dominion at this point, because for an invasion you need good preparation, for which the Empire would not have the time at this point, and a lot of money, which the Empire also did not have. So, at this point the Dominion would probably sue for peace. In these negotiations the Empire would have the high ground, but not a crazy lot of leverage, because they were basically still around the same strength, although the Empire did make a blow to the Dominion's image. So, I think that the short-term effects for the Dominion would largely be that they would need to pay some war reparations to the Empire. The Empire would probably also demand reinstating their ambassadors in Somerset and Valenwood. Perhaps the Empire would also put on some economic sanctions and embargoes over the Dominion, but we don't really know how this would play out in any regard. However, some interesting things that would change opposed to our current timeline would be that first of all Hammerfell would still be at a civil war while it's currently peaceful, and it would not have left the Empire. This conflict, essentially a big border war, would have never been called the Great War at all. It would just be, well, the war. A Great War would perhaps later come. But there would be even larger effects in the grand scheme of things. First of all, the Thalmor would lose a large chunk of their credibility at home. They had promised that they could defeat the Empire and, well, could not. This could lead to new rebellions in Valenwood and possible even protests in Somerset Isles. However, I think that, well, since the Dominion still had a large chunk of its army intact at home, the Dominion armed forces would probably be used to smash down this opposition at home, resulting in an even tighter grip by the Thalmor over Eleanor and Valenwood. Perhaps even the two client states of the Dominion and elsewhere would start to doubt the Thalmor and maybe even revoke the alliance. This could lead to the Thalmor actually using the leftover Dominion forces to fully annex elsewhere and basically instate it as a Dominion province, under their full control now. Ultimately, I think that this scenario would see the Dominion emerging stronger in the end, and both sides would basically be preparing for a large-scale war at this point, because the Thalmor would not want to, well, they wouldn't give up. They would just want to give it another try, and now with Elsewhere as an actual province, that might just give them the edge, by basically mandatory enlisting all Khajiit into the army. I think this scenario would play out in an even bloodier war in a few years, and only the gods know who would win an actual great war, with both sides that have actually been preparing now for a couple of years, because the Empire was very unprepared for the first war. Now, the second scenario is radically different. In this second scenario, the war plays out exactly as in our own timeline. Just watch my video on the Great War to see how that went. But instead of being too weak to continue the fight after the Battle of the Red Ring, the Empire somehow manages to continue the fight, either because it hasn't lost half their forces, or perhaps they had some leftover reinforcements. Doesn't matter how, but they are able to continue. In this scenario, it would be a slow fight, but eventually, well, the Empire would win, because that's the purpose of the video. They would drive the Altmerry troops out of Cyrodiil and reconquering the cities the hard way, and then they quickly built Cyrodiil defenses up while sending parts of the Legion to relieve Hammerfell and drive the Dominion out of that province. Then the war would have been decided at the end of the year 175 and perhaps even 176 of the Fourth Era, with the Empire having driven out the Dominion after a lengthy war, having destroyed their entire Cyrodiil and Hammerfell armies. I still doubt the Empire would continue beyond this point, as well, the Altmerry homeland was still... The defenses in the Altmerry homeland, like the forts, were still intact, and the Empire's homeland defenses would not be able to keep up with an eventual counter-attack on the short term. However, the Dominion was very weak at this point as well, and near the end of the Great War we know that they had gambled all their available military forces on the Cyrodiil campaign, and those were all destroyed now, so the Dominion was very weak as well and would probably not be able to keep up with the war anymore. So at this time, the Dominion would probably sue for peace, and oh boy, the Empire would have way more leverage at this time around, as the Empire would have way more troops left. And basically, they turned the tides on the Dominion in their moment of victory at the Battle of the Red Ring, and that would have created devastating moods at home. The consequences of a new treaty would probably heavily favor the Empire, and while we would never really know what such a treaty might have looked like, I made an interesting setup with some input from the community. This treaty would probably be called the Treaty of Arentia and would end the war in both Cyrodiil and Hammerfell, and probably formally in the year 176 of the 4th era. Among the treaty's terms would be large war reparations from the Dominion to the Empire, parts of northern Valenwood, specifically the region of Arentia Reaper's March, which is basically a region with a huge city with a lot of Imperial influences, would be admitted into Imperial territory and would basically just be transferred to the Empire. Mandatory dismantlement of the alliance with the states of elsewhere, economic sanctions against the Dominion, reduction of the Dominion armed forces, Canarthi's Roost, the island south of elsewhere, would be instated as Imperial territory and would form a very strategic military base for the navy. And in the end, the Empire would gain free reign over the Dominion for Penitus Oculatus agents that would be there to basically have oversight over if treaty terms were being held, so basically Imperial Justicars. This would, for all terms and purposes, be a very harsh treaty for the Dominion, and it would have even graver effects on the long term, since the Empire would now be even stronger with a peaceful Hammerfell as part of its territory. But it would also have very severe effects back home, since basically here the people back home would have gotten the ultimate example of the Thalmor that, well, the Thalmor are not invincible, and the Empire wasn't as weak as they claimed. Thousands of their friends would have died on foreign soil in this war by the Thalmor that they ultimately lost embarrassingly, and now they were hit with huge repercussions instead of, well, at least the glory of a win, as the Thalmor present the First Great War at home in our timeline. This is something they wouldn't be able to do in this timeline. This actually could result in a new Valenwood rebellion like the previous scenario, but in this scenario there's basically no Dominion army left back home to quell the rebellions. This would have great effects on the stability within the Dominion, and in the long term, maybe even the loss of Valenwood as a Dominion province, and it gaining maybe even independence. They probably wouldn't rejoin the Empire, because Valenwood would want to be independent, I'm pretty sure. Also back home, the Thalmor would have, a lot of problems in Alinor, so the Somerset Isles. The High Elves would probably lose faith in the Thalmor after such a devastating loss they had gambled everything on. I don't think the Thalmor would lose power in the Somerset Isles, simply because, well, they would try to hold on to every bit of power with every method possible, but there would definitely be a period of instability and strife in the Somersets. What would happen to elsewhere, we don't really know. They would be fully independent again after this treaty, but we don't know how they would feel about the Dominion and the Empire in general. The Khajiit are, or at least have been, very grateful that the Thalmor brought the moons back. Whether that's true or not is yet to be seen, but the Thalmor claimed it at least. But that does not stop the fact that the Thalmor have embarrassed themselves with this war, and they've shown that they are not invincible and that they are maybe not the great saviors that they present themselves to be to the Khajiit. However, I think that in the end, the southernmost kingdom, Palatine, will probably remain quite close with the Dominion, since it has nearly no contact with the Empire, and thus will be more susceptible to Dominion propaganda, and has been for, well, almost 70 years before the trial of the Great War. But I think that maybe the northernmost kingdom, the kingdom of Anaquina, might actually become an ally of the Empire in the long term, simply because its border cities, which are basically its biggest cities, like Rimmen and Riverhold, are its economic centers, and they have very intensive contact with the Empire, and this might lead to them leaning more towards the Empire in the future, as they have, well, just made more contact with the Empire, and the people of elsewhere meet Imperial, well, representatives of Imperial culture on a daily basis if you live there. This is probably also in our own timeline, that probably the northernmost kingdom leans more towards the Empire than the southernmost kingdom, since they are still independent client states. But yeah, they are just very much allied to the Dominion, but they make their own policies, and that's why I think that Anaquina, so the northernmost, is more leaning towards the Empire, because it simply has more contact with the Empire. This is basically as far as I can go with either scenario, but whichever scenario it is, it would show that the Empire isn't weak. This will result in a more stable Empire in the end, whichever scenario, and a more unstable Dominion. While this never happened, it's interesting to think about this scenario, since, well, the scenarios itself do exist within the universe, in the games. Since the Elder Scrolls universe in the Elder Scrolls universe, the Elder Scrolls themselves, so the physical scrolls, hold insight into every single possible outcome in the future. So chances are, these outcomes we discussed in this video are among them. With that said, leave your thoughts on, well, both scenarios or maybe your own scenario in the comments under this video. If I see any lore mistakes I've made or maybe something I want to correct, I'll put it in the top comment. So always view my top comment first before you comment your own things, because I might have addressed it. With that said, if you liked the video, give it a like, subscribe. If you want to see my future videos coming out the day they come out, click that little bell icon next to the subscribe button. And also, if you want to support me in a more personal way and get your name at the end of every video and some cool Patreon content, subscribe to my Patreon. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. If you want personal contact with me, there's also my Discord and Instagram in the description. On my Instagram, I'm currently having my 50 days of lore, which is basically 50 days consecutively in which I post images containing lore information. So check my Instagram out if you're interested in more lore content other than videos. And with that said, I will see you all in the next lore video. Bye bye.